were there eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection, witnesses who were there at the time he rose from the dead, not just those who saw him later. Christians don't often think about this, but there were 3 different sets of witnesses. Yeah, you heard me correctly. There were sets of witnesses who were there. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul lists the witnesses who saw Jesus in the flesh after the resurrection. There was 500 at one time at a point. But these are after the fact. Yes, they are witnesses. Thomas put his fingers in Jesus' hands and side, but they weren't there. But today we're talking about those who were actually there. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and on this special holiday episode, we're going to present some things you kind of knew, but maybe haven't thought about completely. And that's why so many of you told me you follow this channel to learn things you just don't hear elsewhere. So let's look at the first set of witnesses, the men dressed in white at the tomb. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing spices which they had prepared. These were the women. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. When they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men suddenly stood near them in dazzling white clothing. And as the women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen." Luke 24, 1-6. So before the women arrived, 2 men in dazzling apparel were there. They are definitely 2 witnesses of the resurrection. These are probably the same 2 men who witnessed the ascension later in Acts 1. And they are witnesses that most believers write off as not credible because most think of them as being angels. But even if they were angels, that doesn't discount them from being witnesses, right? They were there. They clearly witnessed to the women who came to the tomb that Jesus had risen. They knew it for a fact. And there were 2 of them, which means it meets God's requirement that there be 2 witnesses for anything to be considered truthful. So angels or human, they were witnesses. Which brings us to a very interesting phrase from the book of Revelation, chapter 11. God refers to 2 men there as my witnesses. We know them as the 2 witnesses, but what exactly did they witness? Is it possible these are the same 2 men who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus? Think about it. We hear the title, the 2 witnesses. So what were they witnessing about? Maybe it was the resurrection, to which you might say, that can't be because those men at the tomb were angels. And that is the overwhelming opinion of scholars today. But it isn't necessarily correct. Just as we saw in Luke 24, the witnesses at the resurrection are called men. In Mark 16, the women encounter a single young man. In Matthew 28, it was a single angel that rolled away the stone and sat on it. And in John, neither men nor angels appeared at the tomb initially, but then 2 angels are seen. What are we to make of this inconsistency? We got 4 Gospels, and we have 4 different answers. Well, all human eyewitness testimony is somewhat inconsistent. People see and remember different things. And in this case, the witnesses couldn't tell if the beings they encountered were men or angels. 2 accounts say men, 2 accounts say angels. I think we could all agree that was probably one or the other. So either the accounts speak of 2 angels that appeared as men, or 2 men that appeared as angels. Both of them were wearing dazzling clothes. Men that could appear and disappear at will. To which you are probably saying, hey, wait a minute, Nelson. None of my friends look like that or act like that. And that is precisely why scholars prefer to say that they were angels, because they had these dazzling clothes and they could appear and disappear at will. And in Matthew, one of them rolled away the stone. But surprisingly, my best guess is that they were actually men. Two men who looked like angels because they appeared earlier in each one of the Gospels. At the transfiguration of Jesus, these two men were Moses and Elijah, who suddenly appeared in dazzling clothing at that event and spoke to Jesus about his upcoming departure or death in Jerusalem. Then they disappeared as quickly as they appeared. They looked and acted like this because they were humans, but in resurrection bodies, the kind that we're going to get when we're resurrected. So to someone seeing them, they probably appeared as angels. But they weren't angels. Now, apparently, either Jesus told the disciples who was present at the transfiguration who those two men were, or maybe Jesus referred to them by name. Moses, Elijah, welcome. Let me tell you about what is about to happen in Jerusalem. Maybe Jesus said something like that. So by some means, the disciples knew who these men were. However, the women at the tomb, they had no such advantage. No one announced to them who these beings were, angels, men. To one, they looked like angels. To another, they looked like men. And that is why the biblical record is inconsistent on this point. So my guess is they actually may have been Moses and Elijah, who had recently appeared with Jesus at the transfiguration. Moses and Elijah in resurrection bodies were capable of doing amazing things, appearing and disappearing, feats of strength like moving the stone. And since I believe Moses and Elijah will be the two witnesses, this also answers what it is they're going to witness about, the resurrection of our Lord. To me, it appears they were there as eyewitnesses. Although I think the first set of witnesses were humans in resurrection bodies, there's a second set, and the second set of witnesses isn't thought of at all by most biblical scholars. And again, the reason is this set of witnesses isn't human. In fact, this set of witnesses aren't even alive. But they were right there at the moment of the resurrection. They are the burial cloth and head covering of Jesus. There was something about these linen wrappings that caused faith in the disciples. Look what the Gospels say about these things. Luke 24:19, Peter saw the linen wrappings only, and he went away to his home marveling at what had happened. So Peter marveled because of linen wrappings? John 20:6-8, Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So the other disciple, who had first come to the tomb, then also entered, and he saw and believed. So there's something very special about these burial clothes. It wasn't the empty tomb, as impressive as that was. It wasn't the stone rolled away that led to faith. What was it? It was the burial cloths that were lying to the side. Well, not necessarily because they were lying to the side. That wasn't any more impressive than the empty tomb. So what was it about the clothes that led John and Peter to believe? Believe in the resurrection. Was there an image on the clothes? An image that was supernaturally imprinted there at the moment of the resurrection? If so, that would impress anyone. So if you have doubted the validity of the famed Shroud of Turin, I understand. Someone has to believe in the supernatural to believe in the shroud. But consider the biblical record. Peter and John believed because of the burial cloth, not the empty tomb. So maybe, if you're skeptical about it, you will consider studying the Shroud of Turin with an open mind. We have a number of interesting videos about the shroud that point out the interesting facts that we've determined. First, The shroud's a three-dimensional image, like a hologram. Second, it wasn't man-made and contains no pigments or dyes. It wasn't painted or drawn. It appears to have been exposed, like a photographic negative. So how is it made? Third, the man in the image was moving at the moment the image was made. That's right. It's sort of like a video of sorts, with multiple images superimposed on the one. Yeah, and that's right. It was a dead man that was moving. And finally, the man in the image has a mortuary name or tag on him, saying he was Yeshua the Nazarene. Now, at the end of this video, we will link to our first video on the shroud that goes over a lot of these points. If you haven't seen that, you're really going to need to watch it. The third set of witnesses is also not considered very often by scholars, because these witnesses weren't believers. But the Roman guard that protected the tomb had a front row seat to what happened that night. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 28, 2-4, it records what happened. An angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. We've already said that this could have been Moses or Elijah in resurrection bodies with the strength to move it. Let's see what else happens after that. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. The guard shook for fear of him and became like dead men. So the guards saw the man in dazzling apparel descend and roll away the heavy stone. Later, this is what Matthew 28, 11-15 says the guards did. Some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that had happened. Catch that. And when they had assembled with the elders and consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say his disciples came by night and stole him away when we were asleep. And if this should come to the governor's ears, we will win him over and keep you out of trouble." And they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story was widely spread among the Jews and is to this day. Pay attention to that first verse. They reported what happened to the chief priests. They reported what really happened. And yet, the priests made up a lie about it. Can you imagine that? Eyewitness testimony about the resurrection, and still, the chief priests did not believe. That is what a hardened heart will do. And you can think about that as you're witnessing to others. You're not always going to break through those hardened hearts. Now, there is extra biblical evidence for the soldier's account that even names names and gives vivid details. It's known as the Acts of Pilate. And supposedly, it was Pilate's report to Caesar about Jesus' death. We have 3 videos on our channel that provide a word-for-word reading of it, plus our commentary. Here is a short portion just about the soldier's testimony. When the great excitement arose about the sepulchre being found empty, I found a deeper solitude than ever. I sent for Malchus, who told me he had placed his lieutenant, Ben Isham, with 100 soldiers around the sepulchre. He told me that Isham and the soldiers were very much alarmed by what had occurred there that morning. Here's another factor. Notice that Pilate uses the name of the man who was in charge of the detail guarding the tomb, Ben Isham. Details like that. A name that could be checked out. Was he there? Could he still be talked to about this event? Things like that just make this whole document ring true. Now, returning to what Pilate had to say. I sent for this man Isham, who related to me, as near as I can recollect, the following circumstances. He said that at about the beginning of the 4th watch, they saw a soft and beautiful light over the sepulchre. He at first thought that the women had come to embalm the body of Jesus, as was their custom, but he could not see how they could have gotten through the guards. While these thoughts were passing through his mind, behold, the whole place was lighted up, and there seemed to be crowds of the dead in their grave clothes. All seemed to be shouting and filled with ecstasy, while all around and above was the most beautiful music he had ever heard, and the whole air seemed to be full of voices praising God. At this time, there seemed to be a reeling and spinning of the earth, so that he turned so sick and faint that he could not stand on his feet. He said the earth seemed to swim from under him, and his senses left him, so that he knew not what did occur. I asked him in what condition he was when he came to himself. He said he was lying on the ground with his face down. I asked him if he could not have been mistaken as to the light. Was it not day that was coming in the east? He said at first he thought of that, but at a stone's cast it was exceedingly dark. Then he remembered it was too early for day. I asked him if his dizziness might not have come from being awakened up and getting up too suddenly, as it sometimes had that effect. He said he was not, and had not been asleep all night, as the penalty was death for him to sleep on duty. He said he had left some of the soldiers asleep at that time. Some were asleep then. I asked him how long the scene had lasted. He said he did not know, but he thought nearly an hour. He said it was hid by the light of day. I asked him if he went to the sepulchre after he had come to himself, and he said no, because he was afraid. Just as soon as relief came, they all went to their quarters. I asked him if he had been questioned by the priests. He said he had. They wanted him to say it was an earthquake, and they were asleep, and offered him money to say the disciples came and stole Jesus. But he saw no disciples. He did not know that the body was gone until he was told. I asked him what was the private opinion of those priests he had conversed with. He said that some of them thought that Jesus was no man, that he was not a human being, that he was not the son of Mary, that he was the same that was said to be born of the Virgin in Bethlehem, that the same person had been on the earth before, with Abraham and Lot, and at many times and places. It seemed to me, if the Jewish theory be true, these conclusions are correct, for they are in accord with this man's life, as is known and testified by both friends and foes, for the elements were no more in his hands than the clay in the hands of the potter. So if you have thought there were no eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection, that simply is not true. God has provided his own witnesses, Moses and Elijah, the soldier's testimony as recorded in the Acts of Pilate, and that amazing Shroud of Turin. We invite you to click right here and keep watching for an incredible look at the cloth that for 2,000 years has been revered as the burial cloth of Jesus. And now science is catching up, and science tests it. And the tests are even more amazing than the way it looks. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.